Yeah, so for a change I want to talk about web development and Haxe, a subject very dear to me. Yeah, I've been going on about this for about 5 years now, I think, in almost all of my talks. Basically, the reason I became quite vocal about it is because at that time, at least, Haxe was like the best in-class tool to target web, and it was just not realized by anybody, neither by web developers nor by Haxe developers. And that was, yeah, for me that was kind of tragic, and I think it's I don't know, time to push that whole thing again. And I mean, I guess now there's finally some delay. Okay. So one of the reasons why many people kind of want to stay clear of the web is it's a real minefield, and the mines come in all kinds of shapes and forms. And so yeah, that part is not really better, and the thing is that whatever's running on top is even kind of worse. So you have like HTML in the DOM, which are like weird and old things, and they are kind of weird around the edges, and all the nice things in HTML actually nobody uses. Most web developers actually hate HTML, and they don't want to use it. Then there's CSS, which is actually super cool, super powerful if you care to learn it, but most web developers hate it because it's so different. And yeah, basically everybody also tries to stay clear of that. And then there's this one thing that all web developers use, is JavaScript, but that one was a lot less designed than all of the above. And now they are trying to somehow fix it by committee. And that's not going so great. So you have a lot of totally random politics, and much of the stuff in the web is like when you surf around, so much stuff is broken all the time. You know, stuff doesn't work. A lot of the time you just reload, then okay, suddenly it works, or I don't know, but basically you wait for half a day until probably some guy who's having the worst night ever is deploying a new version, and it works again. Yeah, most of the time it's really the stuff is broken, and the development culture around is kind of driven by many hypes because there's just so many people, and it's easy to get in. Like people can pick up web development within 2 weeks and then start getting themselves into really big trouble down the road. But in the end, we do get like some really nice web applications. I think most of the stuff that is actually used in the Haxe community runs on WebTech. Even the main IDE that we're kind of pushing isn't like that. And yeah, so the thing is, web development. I think in the Haxe community, it's easy to forget that. But it's if you look at, for example, the Stack Overflow surveys, how developers self-identify, then you see like there's a whole lot of web stuff. Then in between there's designers and QAs. And game development seems to be like a relatively small tranche, at least on Stack Overflow. So I thought like, okay, obviously this is the case because Stack Overflow is full of JavaScript and PHP monkeys who copy paste code, and then but fortunately they kind of listed work experience by these segments, and we see as it updates more or less, yeah, it's more or less the same across the respondents to the survey. Not so much across the users, but for the survey, it seems to be. I mean, I'm not saying that somebody who has 8 years experience in PHP is as much of a crack as somebody who does 8 years of C++ game programming, but at least he's not somebody who will only copy paste stuff. You know, I think he probably also knows a few things. So yeah, based on this data, I made a infographic of my own, comparing these two, and then there's in the Haxe community, I determined very scientifically gut feeling that the ratio is about the converse of that. Many of the days I feel it's even worse. So yeah, technically, if we assume that the Stack Overflow ratio is somehow representative of the whole world, And if we assume that we can somehow make Haxe as appealing to web developers as we do to game developers, then there should be 100 times more web developers and 10 times more Haxe people in the whole community. Which I'm sure, if we ever have that, will not be without its challenges, but I think it will also have many, many advantages. So yeah, and I think there's actually a path there, and that the web actually is in bad need of fixing, and I think one of the best indicators is, like, if you look at all the stuff that springs up in the web, it's clear that people are really, really, really anxious to get some stuff. They haven't discovered Haxe yet. I'm just putting this here as a comparison point. But you have like all of these weird projects. For example, Elm, which is like a super watered down Haskell, which every true Haskell programmer will say is not even a proper language. But somehow it came way after Haxe, and it gathered much more following. There's also much more events. I mean, I'm just using GitHub Star as a rough proxy. There's probably better ways to measure it. But unfortunately, we lost Jason O'Neill, for those who still know to Elm. Yeah. And Prezi, I think, also was one of the founding partners of the Haxe Foundation, if I remember correctly. They also ditched Haxe for Elm. So that does seem to be something about it. Then there's PureScript, which is a bit more like Haskell. Franco went there, the original PHP target maintainer. Stefan, if you know him, he was basically always trying to use macros to turn Haxe into Haskell. So he got very happy there. And there's even some super random stuff like Imba I discovered just the other day, which is basically Ruby syntax with JSX and a bit of a web framework in there for front-end stuff. And it's already somehow more popular than Haxe. Which means, I guess, if we could somehow get Haxe out to these people, they would probably eat it up. But
Do you have an idea?
Well, and there's I don't know. There's the thousand other things. And what I really think is quite interesting is that Haxe can fix all of this stuff better. Like, for example, if you look at least two of these candidates, they are very, very specific about how you should be programming, how you should not be programming. I mean, it's pure functional stuff, and I think one of the things I like about Haxe is very sane with its multi-paradigm thing, and you just, attack the problem from multiple angles until you find the paradigm that matches, and you can move on. And we can give that to people. Also, I think for Haxe, it will be quite a good thing, because we need the next thing that we can assimilate. Worn out Flash developers won't really work as a new stream of influx into the community. And in the end, I think everybody benefits, all those lost souls that we can capture. And I think even for us, it might have an upside here or there. So yeah, and the way that it actually works already for, almost any place where you want to use Haxe, and the web in particular, if you want to infiltrate an ecosystem with Haxe, it's relatively easy. You can, because what's amazing, you can just learn the stuff that is in that ecosystem. So you don't need to learn the language that is there, and the APIs and all the things. You can take the language that you know, take the popular libraries in there, popular APIs, get going. So for example, if you're ever interested to learn about web development, then you don't need to learn JavaScript, which is this mind-bogglingly understood language. You can just take all the skills that you have and get rolling with what's there. And as you start understanding the problem domain, and this is what I think is really nice, you can bring in all your intuitions from other ecosystems in with Haxe and start to just design better stuff on top. And once done with that process, you have really quite amazing superpowers. Because usually by the end of it, you're probably as efficient as people who use the native language there, but you also had the opportunity to evolve other things from to bring in newer perspectives to the platform. For the web, unfortunately, this is somehow becoming increasingly harder to make the leap in front of what the web does, because there's so many people working on it. So Haxe is clearly better in many ways, but the other tools have such immense support structures, basically, that it's kind of becoming a problem to be able to show to clients or stakeholders or anybody like this is clearly the better thing, and to be faster than other people with Haxe. But yeah, I mean, so I want to just talk about some stuff that I did. Actually, one of the first things when I started using Haxe with Nico, because I wanted to have something on the server, was to implement Event Dispatcher from Flash, because that was the only thing I knew, and of course I did it. Then sometime later I found out that it totally subverts the subsystem, does not encapsulate it properly. I looked a bit at msignal, found that very interesting, but it also had these encapsulation problems. I started to roll my own thing for my various projects. Then I redesigned it. It came into a library, which is now Tincore. Then I re-implemented that a whole bunch of times and re-implemented it again. And in the end, the thing is actually, I think, pretty good. For example, if you compare that with Node.js native emitter, and you have some event that's coming like very often, and you need to put in a lot of events, but also remove the listeners again, then it's gonna take about 2 seconds, because the functions are used as keys, and that means that removal is gonna have linear cost. And if you use cancellation tokens, which is some idea I stole from C#, basically, then the cancellation comes at constant cost, and hence the whole thing just doesn't break up under a lot of pressure suddenly. And there's other niceties, so it has like a call stack cap, so when you like nest a lot of handlers in one another, and it sees that the stack gets too deep, then it propagates the dispatch to the next frame, so that you don't get stack overflows in your event handling, which may seem like something that wouldn't happen, but if you work in a corporate environment long enough, then you get worried about these kind of things. And the nice thing is also these cancellation tokens that are there are first class values, so you can compose them. Like if you have many different things that you want to clean up, you can just collect the cancellation tokens, put them into one, and then you can just clear that whole thing. It also has private dispatch. I know I'm probably the only person on the planet who cares about that, but it gives better encapsulation. So stuff like that. And it performs decently fast, and it scales better than, for example, native thing. And I went down that path for a long time, and at the end of it, I decided to bring this all up to a web framework, which is built on a relatively simple HTTP abstraction, which basically says a server application is something that has an incoming request and gives you an outgoing response. The nice part about it is if you write your server this way, it's easy to test without actually running the whole thing over HTTP. And this was, for me, I mean, for a long time I was just using Haxe Web Dispatch, but they're basically the HTTP response that you're producing, which is the one thing that matters, is what you print to standard out. So your whole application basically is one side effect machine. And the thing that you're producing is a side effect of your code, which seems just wrong. And and clients are just the thing, but in reverse. There are a few nuances here that need not interest you. And actually, when I first made that abstraction layer, Ben Merckx, if you know the guy, he created an Express-like framework actually on top of this abstraction, which for me was like my big dream. Also, that UFront was gonna be using this, but at some point everybody was interested in that, unfortunately. And the basic idea that underlines Think Web is that I don't want all of this HTTP stuff to actually get in my way. And the best way that I've ever heard anybody explain it was Rob Martin, who was looking at a couple of Rails applications, and he noticed that they all look the same, regardless of what they do. They all have the same folder structure, everything, and what the thing does, you find out like deep in the hierarchy, or when you use it. And that's kind of silly. Like if you look at the architectural drawing of a church, you see that it's a church, and for a school, you see that it's a school. You can see that you don't have like one folder with all the bricks in it and one folder with all the doors. And that's not how it's arranged. Like, architecture should scream intent at you. And I wanted to make a framework that kind of follows this idea. So the way that you do it is actually, if you want to do HTTP. You forget about HTTP and you model a clean interface, just normal, standard, boring OOP. And for the server, you can implement that interface. So just to show how that looks, if we wanted to implement, let's say, this is part of the GitHub API, only to mess with some issues. Is this big enough? Maybe this is too big. Then basically, if you want to play with the issues of a repo within some organization, then this is basically the structure that GitHub looks like to you. You have a root at which you can get organizations, then you can get repos, and then you can get issues of a repo or create a new one. And then what you basically do, independently of that, you annotate the whole thing with metadata. So for example, you say, okay, this is achieved by subrouting for the part. Then you figure out that, okay, actually issue details on GitHub are called body, not details. So you annotate that. And then you put in the URLs and the HTTP methods that you need to do. But this is like noise that does not ever, if they choose to rename something or route on, for example, you can also do things like, if you wanted to, you can route on query parameters. I mean, this was like more like in the 1990s, but people did write code this way at some point. And you could do that, and it will kind of just figure it out. So what you then do is you either make a client or a router. What a router does is it dispatches incoming requests onto the object. Then it validates all the stuff that is in there. Are there missing fields? Was this request made from a form? Then I'm going to use form parsing for that. Was it made by JSON? Then I'm going to use JSON parsing. And it's going to run your code. Then it's going to get that stuff back. If the user agent identified itself as something that expects HTML, meaning probably a browser, then it's going to run a template on that if you want that. Or if you're just making normal requests, then you're going to get the data back, which means that you can serve the API and the web application from the same endpoint, basically, as it's actually intended. And yeah, the whole thing runs and it gets out of the way. What you concern yourself is naming things properly and separating them properly and this kind of stuff. And we'll find it amazingly hard to build any such thing in languages other than Haxe. So yeah, which is not to say that they're not really great and fun other web frameworks, but I think that wouldn't that particular quality I think is something quite unique. Then there's some other stuff I will briefly touch on. Coconut is my attempt to somehow fix UI programming. Because the main problem is that it sucks. Many people hate it, try to avoid it. I know somebody who sometimes says that. But yeah, Lars kind of like realized for a few days of features that he adds to a game, he needs about 2 months to make the UI for that, because it's somehow hard and weird. And what I did with Coconut was basically steal a lot of ideas from everywhere, because it's always easier if you come last to the party, then you can pick the best the stuff, of course. So one thing I felt strongly about was to have a strong model view separation as proposed by MVC, but I hate controllers to this day. I don't know what controllers are, what it means. It's just, for me, it's the dark place where you put code that doesn't fit into model or view. So I didn't want to have a dark place. And it's with an observable data layer that is kind of takes some cues from RX, but mostly from Knockout.js, which many people don't know, but Knockout.js was the first library that was really good at figuring out tracking state changes on complex object trees, basically. And nowadays there's since a while actually, there's a very similar JavaScript library called MobX. And I wanted to have reactive views because that sounds cool. Which is an idea clearly borrowed from React, but the main idea is that you describe your view structure once, you describe your data in models, then you basically instantiate the view and you pass the data in, and then the framework takes care of then everything is always in the right state in theory, without any mediation controllers, all this kind of stuff. So the result was pretty good. If you use this to target the web, it's faster and smaller than React, but you can also use the React backend, which means that all the views that you make fall out as React components, and all the React components that interest you, you can take them from NPM and then shove them in. It has a bit less mad science than RX, which I find is a very interesting library, but the amount of combinators is just staggering sometimes. And it's also, I don't know, maybe some people heard of Redux. That's like super cool in the React community, to actually not have to have all your state in your views. You want to put it somewhere else, and of course there's a lot of holy wars going around how you should do it. And some people think that everything should be functional. They use Redux, and then the result is also sometimes weird. You need to learn words like transducers and stuff like that. And one thing that is actually pretty nice, it's also safer than MobX, in that the framework has its own kind of static analyzer that tries to prevent you from passing mutable but non-observable data into views. Meaning, if you want something if you want to pass something, it must be observable. If it's immutable, then it's easy to observe because you observe it once. But basically, you can't pass some stuff that you modify and then it doesn't update. Or like, there's of course a way to opt out of those checks, but by default, it should work. And it's quite portable because very Haxe inspired, no platform specific code and most of that stuff. So there's a React backend, there's a Haxe UI backend, which seems to work quite cool. Somebody actually is using it on C++ now. Amazing. And there's also an experimental H2D backend, which is still waiting for test pilots. So H2D is the 2D layer of heaps. And I don't know, somebody was using heaps, or was it Domkit, and complaining that he didn't get it. And I said, okay, maybe I can try, but I think it was Rudy, yeah, but I'm not really sure. But so far I didn't get any how should I say feedback. And one of my last projects that I've been working on is a thing I called 6, and that is actually because nobody likes writing CSS, to basically write your CSS in Haxe, with some really nice advantages. So I wanna be showing this. Like, this is maybe is this still big enough? This kind of fits all the code. So what this does is And I have a few parameters here, I guess. Yeah. And maybe why not this. Okay. So basically, what you see here is a moment. Okay, so what you see is a lot CSS-like. There's some resemblance to CSS preprocessors, and that's essentially what it is. It's a CSS preprocessor embedded into Haxe. The interesting part is, because it's embedded in Haxe, you can rely on variables that you define in Haxe. I mean, to be more exact, it has to be constants. If you use variables for now, it doesn't compile as soon as you reference them, for a set of reasons I will explain in a moment. It has some relatively simple type checking in there. So for example, if you say you want to add to and size, then it tells you can't add scalars and length and stuff like that. So that's pretty neat. And one of the nice things it does is it makes sure that this CSS does not clash with other stuff. I mean, it's relatively easy to use. So for example, here you see we define keyframes for an animation. I mean, let's look at what this thing does. Yeah. It's basically this awesome button. Somebody wanted me to do an animation last time. This time I'm prepared. Okay. And so what that would look like is how that is used, and that doesn't particularly depend on any framework. We have some huge class, and we add a fancy class to it, and we add a class that we don't actually even name. And if we look at the generated output, where's the inner HTML? Yeah. So basically here we see that this inline thing, for example, is moved out into a global constant and all this kind of stuff. So there's one way to run it, and the thing that's pretty neat, for example, I mean, two things are quite interesting. One is you can also say that you want to not have the code in your generated output, but you want to have it in a static file because you want to use this in PHP or something. So if I hit compile now, I should have tried this before. Then we see that all the CSS is out of here. Only some cryptic short class names are left of all that stuff. And all the CSS winds up in here. So for example, yeah, it can also do some funky stuff. So for example, this data URI here basically loads the image from the file system and then puts it as an inline SVG into your CSS. All this kind of pretty fancy stuff. And if, for example, we were to remove, and let's check out a few other things. You might have noticed, wow, is the Haxe logo big? Some other stuff. For example, there's this animation I just called rotate that also gets like some unique noise in there, so it doesn't clash because all CSS animations share one global namespace. So basically, you can give stuff the same names; it won't conflict. And so yeah, if we remove this fancy class and it's not used anywhere, then okay, yeah. And then we compile it. Something is awfully slow. Well, who cares? Then it's also gone from the output. So like this is very, it hooks into Haxe DCE to figure out which CSS classes are used and are not used, and the stuff that is not used is not in your output. So what makes this super interesting is actually you can share just styles or maybe components views within libraries, which depend on 6, and somebody just draws in a component. All the styles that belong with it come in either your generated code or the style sheet that is generated for you. You have zero setup. You don't have to install Webpack or Rollup or all this kind of stuff. Configure it, figure out how this thing works, wait every time for your CI to download dependencies for 3 minutes. So yeah, that's actually a pretty neat thing. It's still missing a few things here and there, but yeah, on the whole, it's getting there, I would say. Yeah. Ah, okay, and I also wrote this down for myself. Yeah. So essentially, Haxe is the right thing, I guess. That's what it means. But the problem is that worse is better. This is actually something that was said about Lisp 40 years ago. And the fact that while Lisp is an amazingly well-designed thing, other technologies, in this case the JavaScript of the era was C, it seems. C was way more compromising on many fronts, and as a result got way bigger adoption, and at the end many of the problems that C actually had was then solved in a crowdsourced way, because many people started caring and linters were developed and better compilers and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, this is kind of what's I think happening to Haxe in regard to the web right now, is just all this other stuff that I would prefer not to use is catching up a lot, and it's becoming Hexe's how should I say, advantage is becoming somewhat indistinguishable. So yeah, that's why being like a Haxe developer these days feels like being a bit of a guerrilla warrior fighting a war on 3 fronts at the same time. Surrounded by, well, business people who will tell you that Haxe talent is super hard to hire. They never heard of Haxe. Like, what is this? To them, it's just high risk, and that to business people is usually a no-go. And the benefits to them are like super unclear. I mean, if you get super nerdy in front of them, it doesn't really help prove your point. And I think this is something that would probably be very unlikely to be able to fix, because there's a bit of a problem. We're just not really good at business. This is not our strong suit. Other people are, not us. Then the third front, where there's always a lot of fighting going on, is with the compiler team, which basically has no skin in the game as far as web development is concerned. I mean, as far as I know, I think Rudy is probably the only guy who actually uses Haxe for web development for his job and has his existence depending on it. And I think this is probably, one of the reasons why Haxe is so good for and satisfying for people who use it for gaming, because the people who contribute to the compiler write games with it, improve it for that thing, super good. And for the web, we're kind of lacking that sort of mechanism or need or way to have that done. And I think, the situation is kind of reversed. Whenever something kind of exciting happens in the JavaScript or web world, then the whole compile team is like, not this again. When will it be over? And I cannot get why, but I don't know. It's part of the thing. It's weird things happen when many people get together. And one of the things is, I think that many low-hanging fruits that could be dealt with are not dealt with, because it's like the use case is not understood, or you can do it yourself with macros, but at some point you have so much macros in your code base that you're like compiling forever, and you wonder like, why not switch to a tech that has all this stuff, and in the end will be, even though it's a way slower compiler, in the end will give you your next compilation faster. So yeah, and I guess the main point on which I want to just yes. And I'm actually just going to touch on this briefly. But I think the point where this kind of becomes clear that there's kind of an issue is I think there's quite a few people who have somehow agreed that using XML to describe UI is good. It's not the best thing, but in this case, worse is better. And the difference that you have syntactically doesn't really matter. I don't think you can design a better syntax. I mean, that is so much clearly better. It's just, if you use XML, everybody's going to understand it. We speak English because everybody speaks it. UI people use XML because, you know, everybody can understands it. And yeah. And basically, if you look at it, there's a whole industry of people who just do that. I guess it's the biggest software companies. I mean, Oracle is not fair because in Java they do everything with XML, so you can't really say whether for UI it's particularly useful. But hey, there's also this this French guy who likes to describe UI in XML. Then there's this Irish guy. No, British. I think Irish guy. And there's me. After 2017, I kind of gave into the idea. Before that, I was kind of torn. On the other hand, you do have some people who say, okay, it's nice to have a different DSL. Apple is, for example, moving in that direction with Swift UI. Kotlin does that. People who don't write much UI code form this opinion very often. And I guess maybe until 2013, I also had the same opinion, and I actually maintained a library that allowed this kind of stuff. But then I started working with designers and explaining them how to make that stuff work was impossible. Whereas for XML, it was just, yay, cool, let's move on. And so there's a third category, and it has a rather long title. It's people who think that support for embedding LaTeX is as important as first-class support for UI description markup. And in that category, we have one data point. And because of that, the discussion is coming like kind of to a deadlock. I mean, I would personally, whatever we do, I think we should specify something. It can be DOMKit 100% or something, but I want something specific, and we can still find cool ways to embed LaTeX into Haxe, I think. But for some reason, Nicola maintains the position that no, we should solve all possible issues at the same time. While UI is a thing, it's a costly thing to develop. I think the best developer experience that we can provide is what we should have. And so yeah, the last of the three fronts where you're fighting is of course other web developers who are strangely concerned about the total lack of hype. And of course there's like no webpack, we don't have modules, generators, async await, JSX, error functions, destruction, all this kind of stuff. Like some of it is coming. None of it really matters, but these are the questions that you get, right? And one of that is actually kind of funny, like I hear this a lot, JS is already full stack, why introduce any overhead, you know? Anytime I sit down with those people and have 10 minutes to show them what Haxe can do, they start, you see it starts, you know, working somehow, okay, maybe, if I had time, but usually they don't, because the main problem is that all people totally suck at taking decisions, and usually we take them superficially. Like just the other day we were talking about on the Slack, does anybody know some cool self-hosted Git thing? And I just pulled out something that I remembered, and I remembered it because it kind of looks like GitHub, and I posted that and everybody was, oh, this looks good. It's kind of like GitHub, but it's open source. And I mean, everybody formed a judgment on total bullshit, and that's what we do all the time. We run around like that. When others do it, then it's clear that it's nonsense. When we do it, we don't notice it, you know. But kind of, I guess what I'm getting at, maybe it's not such a bad way to make Haxe look like GitHub. Although in that case, GitHub is kind of JavaScript, which makes it even a lot more disgusting to say, but it's something to consider. And but I think one of the really more profound things that would be kind of nice to be able to work on would be to improve developer experience. And the reason why I was talking about inline XML is, for example, unless we have some type of proper shared understanding or specification of what the syntax is for an inline markup, you will never be able to provide a decent developer experience. You want to have stuff like proper syntax highlighting, which otherwise is impossible. You want to have the IDE to close the text after you open it. I mean, all this kind of stuff that's like, why am I even talking about it? Because everybody who has ever edited HTML knows that this is kind of normal, and in Haxe we can't give that to people. And I think it kind of matters. And I know that it's trivial and boring and useless to people who don't do web development. but I think there's I think it's worth pursuing, and I think developer experience is actually our entry point. I think of the people that we're most likely to convince, it's other web developers who kind of use the least bad thing that they could find, and we can give them something much, much better. And yeah, I would love if we could do that. That's it. Questions?
Yeah, I think early in the presentation your point was that Haxe delivers like the best or a good experience for web developers.
5 years ago I would have said that without a shred of a doubt, yes.
Okay, I'm just wondering because you gave these examples of people who were using Haxe and then switched to some other technology.
Yes.
So like what's your reasoning? If Haxe is the better option, why did they move to something else?
Well, for one, it's relatively hard to score a job in web development with Haxe, because not many companies want to do it, because they can't find, they think like you're the only candidate that they're ever going to have, basically. That's a problem. Then I guess there was some frustration over facts that we just, I mean, stuff like immutability and short functions were just added like a year or two ago. And some people feel super strongly about this kind of stuff. And you have just, I mean, they've always kind of liked the functional aspect of Haxe more. And Haxe kind of, I think in many ways is neglecting that, has been. And it's kind of okay, I get that. Like, Nicola's main target these days is hashlink, and it doesn't have much of a garbage collector, so you don't want to be doing functional programming, basically. I mean, yeah, but
okay, understood.
It's not like everybody jumps ship. Many people get pushed out. Simply, Philippe, for example, is a guy who's been contributing a lot to web development in Haxe, but his company is basically just ditching Haxe. It happens. Okay.